Night after night, by an old-fashioned fireplace, we plotted the coming agitation. How, when, and where each entering wedge could be driven, by which women might be recognized and their rights secured. Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
In the year of 1848, a small group of women gathered together and dared the impossible. They convened the first women's rights convention ever, an act of courage that sparked the ongoing struggle for women's equality. Seneca Falls, New York, was the staging ground for their call to action, a bustling industrial boomtown reflecting many of the changes then transforming American life. Looking back, it seems almost inevitable that the struggle for women's equality took root here. From the very beginning, it was water that drew people to the Seneca Falls area. Its first inhabitants, the Iroquois, called the area Caraccilo, swift waters. Abundant forests and plentiful waters made it the fruitful hunting ground for 6 Indian nations. Military detachments moved through Caraccilo in 1779, destroying Indian villages and pushing the 6 nations northward. One of these soldiers, Lawrence Van Cleef, returned a decade later. He built a sturdy log house on the flat land of the river valley and went into the portage business, carrying travelers and their goods overland around a mile-long stretch of churning river rapids. Van Cleef and his business were in a good position to prosper. For the next 50 years, drawn by an offering of free land to Revolutionary War veterans, thousands of settlers streamed westward through the flats. To encourage migration, New York State cleared the paths of Native American trade routes through the area and built a toll road called the Great Western Turnpike. Opening the turnpike was a pivotal event, providing the major gateway to the Northwest Territories for the next 100 years. The Flats area, where the turnpike crossed the Seneca River, became a busy transportation crossroads.
Seneca Village at the falls of the Seneca River is fast improving and must become a brisk trading place as the country populates. Here is a carrying place and Minder's Mills with 15 houses.
Power potential of the village's rapids and falls appealed to enterprising settlers. Colonel Wilhelmus Minders gave the area its industrial start when he built the first flour mill in 1795. Water navigation improved quickly as more mills sprang up. The Bayard Company, owners of important grain mills and all the water power on both sides of the river, built a canal and series of stone locks between Cayuga and Seneca lakes as a way to take boats through rather than around the river rapids. When the Cayuga-Seneca Canal was finished in 1818, Seneca Falls had an important new link in its transportation network. 10 years later, the network expanded further when New York State took over the waterway and connected it to the Great Erie Canal system. Along the waterfront, commercial activity flourished. In 7 years, the population grew from 200 to 2,000. By the time it was incorporated in 1831, the village of Seneca Falls had taken on the air of a vibrant boomtown, boasting fire and police departments, a newspaper, and a community band. New schools and churches appeared, along with regular packet boat service carrying passengers and freight. Driving Seneca Falls' new prosperity was a small, energetic band of entrepreneurs. Ansel Bascom, the town's first civic leader, Gary Sackett, its first lawyer, and a host of other prominent residents. All of them committed to the town's economic and social progress, and many were friends of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's family.
The cars were filled to overflowing, and their approach to this village was announced by the roaring of cannon and the shouts of a vast multitude of citizens and strangers welcoming the steam horse and his load.
In 1841, the first railroad train steamed into Seneca Falls. New factories manufactured products that could now be easily exported. The factory work drew thousands of immigrants to Seneca Falls, and by 1842, the town had a population of 4,000. The rapid industrialization brought social changes as well. changes that affected men's and women's lives differently.
An American woman best shows her patriotism by staying at home, where she has the blessed advantage of her Bible and a well-balanced mind.
While men left the home to work long hours building businesses and running factories, women, at least middle-class women, were cast as fragile and loyal guardians of family life, living proof of their husband's earning power. Idleness, a crime in colonial America, became instead a symbol of status. Some women did factory piecework at home. Those few who went into the factories performed work requiring the lowest skill and paying the lowest wage, wages that became the property of their husbands. And women bore a double burden. Working hard, exhausting days in the factories, they returned home each evening to long hours laboring at their women's work, keeping the house and maintaining the family.
Every fiber in my being rebelled, although silently. All the hours that I sat and sewed gloves for a miserable pittance, which after it was earned could never be mine. I wanted to work, but I wanted to choose my task, and I wanted to collect my wages.
Women's unequal place in society was one of many 19th century social ills attracting the attention of reform-minded activists. To Seneca Falls came speakers from the abolitionist and temperance reform movements.
Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reforms. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass.
The fires of evangelical religious movements raged through the area as well, with such intensity that it was labeled the burned-over district. Amidst the constant stream of people and ideas that flowed through Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband, Henry, a journalist and abolitionist, arrived in 1847. They settled in a large house at the corner of Washington and Seneca Streets on the village outskirts. In Seneca Falls, Stanton lived almost literally between the pastoral world of the early 1800s and the increasing industrialization of the 1840s. She could look out her back door and see fields and fruit trees, while from her front porch, she saw mill wheels and smoking chimneys. Across Bayard Street were the homes of substantial Yankee families, while down the hill lived immigrant families struggling to make ends meet. Middle-class values of the day did not expect women like Stanton to be serious thinkers or to fulfill any purpose outside the home. With her husband often away on business, leaving her alone to care for 3 young children, Stanton grew increasingly frustrated with the narrow sphere of women's lives. What she saw in her neighbors' crowded homes, the poverty and alcoholism, the physical abuse, the women's total economic dependence on the men in their families, transformed her.
I now fully understood the practical difficulties most women had to contend with in the isolated household. And the wearied, anxious look of the majority of women impressed me with a strong feeling that some active measures should be taken to remedy the wrongs of society in general and of women in particular.
An accomplished musician, Stanton reflected her changing perspective even in the music she played. In Seneca Falls, the Stantons' home became a regular stopping place for notable reform lecturers. The Stantons found other reform-minded families living in the area as well. Amelia Bloomer, a well-known campaigner for dress reform and soon to be the publisher of The Lily, one of the country's most progressive women's and temperance publications. Thomas and Mary Ann McClintock, long-standing supporters of equal rights for women and members of the Waterloo Quakers, a progressive community that also included Jane and Richard Hunt, strong abolitionists. In the summer of 1848, Jane Hunt invited Stanton for tea at her home in Waterloo to renew her friendship with Lucretia Mott, a founder of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, and to meet Mott's sister, Martha Wright, and other Quaker friends.
I poured out that day the torrent of my long-accumulated discontent, with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself as well as the rest of the party to do and dare anything. We decided then and there to call a women's rights convention.
The women's grievances were clear. Their lives were governed by laws, customs, and religious doctrines that exacted many duties, but almost no rights. Women could not vote. They had no property rights. Married women themselves were considered their husband's property, as were their children. If they emerged to attend public meetings, custom required them to remain silent. At Jane Hunt's tea, the women set in motion a movement that would attempt to redefine American society's conception of human worth and expand its notion of social and civic justice. When the women looked for a meeting place for the proposed convention, the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, overlooking the mills on the Seneca River, was a natural choice. The Wesleyan Methodists so regularly opened their chapel to reform speakers that it was called the Great Lighthouse. Major abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison held forth there. The Wesleyan Methodists were committed activists who fully recognized the rights of women. Not everyone in Seneca Falls agreed.
An eccentric genius has been lecturing in New York on the rights of women. He thinks women should vote, should participate in the duties of juries, and have a voice in the engagements of our government. What absurd stuff is all this prattle about the rights of women?
Mid-July, a blistering hot summer day, the roads, waterways, and railroads leading to Seneca Falls were crowded with women and men headed for the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. At the chapel, it was a supportive gathering of 300 people, many of them progressive Quakers. Even so, custom required that a man chair the meeting. Lucretia Mott's husband, James, was chosen. The focus of the convention was Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments. Modeled after the Declaration of Independence, it sought to extend democratic rights to women.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Resolved, that women secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise.
When the convention was over, a storm of criticism burst across the country. Public speakers were vehement in their attacks.
The most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of womanity.
So pronounced was the popular voice against us that most of the ladies who had attended the convention and signed the declaration withdrew their names and influence and joined our persecutors.
Public speakers were vehement in their attacks, but nothing could please Stanton more.
It is just what I wanted. Imagine the publicity given to our ideas by thus appearing in a widely circulated sheet like the Herald. It will start women thinking, and men too.
The convention was a turning point for the women's rights movement. In the decades to follow, the Seneca Falls activists continued to press for social change. In 1850, Amelia Bloomer introduced Stanton to a sister temperance fighter, Susan B. Anthony. Stanton and Anthony together produced a philosophy and strategy for the new women's rights movement that enabled it to grow into a national cause. Although neither woman would live to see it, their work would lead, in 1920, to universal suffrage for women in America. Even while it struggled with the new ideas brought on by changing times, Seneca Falls continued building into a thriving industrial center with national and international markets. Flour mills gave way to pump-building factories that produced local inventions, like Birdsall Holly's rotary pump and engine. On Days Island, the Silsby Manufacturing Company used Holly's invention to build the first steam fire engine in 1856, inaugurating a new era in firefighting. Beginning at a time when fire prevention and good firefighting equipment was practically non-existent, manufacturing plants like Downs Pumps and Cowing's Fire Engine Factory turned out the best firefighting equipment in the world for the next half-century. With passing time, as the Cayuga and Seneca Canal became antiquated, New York State undertook to build a controversial new barge canal system which would flood the flats, the site of Seneca Falls' earliest settlement. On November 27, 1914, dismantling and removal of all buildings in the area began. Brahman Mills, site of the original Minders Mill, came down, along with 115 other factories. 60 residential buildings were moved. In 1915, 125 years after Lawrence Van Cleef built his log house here, the first boats passed over the flooded flats, now called Van Cleef Lake. Today, Seneca Falls has a new identity as a historic site and tourist area. The rebuilt Goulds Pump Company remains as the town's only standing pump factory and a reminder of the village's industrial past. The Seneca Knitting Mills, last of the stone mill buildings, still operates. The old Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, host to fervent reformers, was renovated many times over, and today endures as a historic monument to the bright haven it once provided. The homes of the Hunts, the McClintocks, and the Stantons all still stand. More than clapboard and brick, the buildings and streets of Seneca Falls are witnesses to our heritage, with important stories to tell. The talking and planning that happened behind these windows, the conditions in the homes and mills beside the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, all gave rise to what is now our cultural legacy. In the struggle for equal rights for women that continues today, we are connected to the remarkable women of Seneca Falls by their courage and guiding vision of justice.
Our successors have a big work before them, much bigger, in fact, than they imagined. We are only the stone that started the ripple, but they are the ripple that is spreading and will eventually cover the whole pond.